Hello everyone, I welcome you to the Climate Connect webinar on Australia's carbon tax and cap and trade scheme. Firstly, I would like to tell you more about Climate Connect. We are a specialist news and data provider in the emerging post-2012 environmental markets. We have offices around the world. In the US, we are based in Kentucky. In Europe, we are based in London. And in Asia, we are based in New Delhi and Beijing. Our expertise in the Australian carbon markets. We have published over 50 news stories on Australia's carbon markets, some of which are listed here. We recently published the Carbon Tax Analyst Note. We also publish a post-2012 carbon markets report every Friday. The presentation structure. We'll start off with an introduction to Australia. Then we'll move on to the emissions profile and the targets announced by Australian government. Then we'll discuss the carbon tax and its various aspects. Then we'll discuss the demand for international offsets under the scheme. Next, we'll look at the economic impact of the carbon price mechanism. Then we'll discuss the various other carbon schemes announced by Australia. And finally, Australia's stand on climate change. Introduction to Australia. Australia's GDP in 2010 was $1.235 trillion. Its area is 7.6 million square kilometers with a population of 22.7 million. It has among the highest per capita emissions with 17.7 tons in 2007. Australia ratified the Kyoto Protocol in December 2007. In 2010, Australia's greenhouse gas emissions were 542 million tons. Australia has announced a national target to reduce its carbon emissions by 5% by 2020 from 2000 levels. In 2010, Australia's carbon emissions were 542 million tons, which translates into a reduction target of 76.5 million tons between 2010 and 2020. The carbon tax scheme. The Australian government has announced implementation of a carbon price regime which includes a carbon tax between July 2012 and July 2015, which will then be replaced by a cap and trade mechanism from July 2015. Collectively, these schemes are covered under the Clean Energy legislation. The price of allowances auctioned and distributed by the government will be closely related to the international average carbon prices. The carbon tax, which will be introduced from July 2012, will have a quantum of 23 Australian dollars per ton of carbon emissions. The carbon tax will be increased by 5% annually till 2015. From July 2015, the cap and trade mechanism will be introduced. During the first 3 years of the cap and trade mechanism, the floor price and the ceiling price will be regulated by the government. The floor price and ceiling price will also increase during this period. The sectors covered under the carbon tax. The threshold for inclusion in the carbon price scheme is emission of 25,000 tons of emissions annually through direct sources or scope 1 emissions as they are called in Australia. About 500 companies are covered under the carbon price scheme. Power, industrial processes and mining companies constitute 44% of the liable entities under the carbon scheme. Some of the major companies likely to be affected by the carbon scheme are Rio Tinto, BHP Billiton, Shell Australia, and MacArthur Coal. Most of these entities are located in three states: Queensland, New South Wales, and Victoria. Together, these states have at least 330 companies, or 66% of the total liable entities. Not all emissions and sources are covered under the carbon price scheme. Emissions from international shipping and aviation, as well as those from agricultural practices, have been excluded. Fugitive emissions from decommissioned mines and legacy emissions from landfills have also been excluded. Hydrofluorocarbon, perfluorocarbon, and hexafluoride emissions have also been excluded. Use of transport fuels in light commercial vehicles or in households have been excluded. Use of liquid fuels by heavy-duty vehicles will attract carbon price from 2014, while the tax credits on gaseous fuels will be reduced to zero. Off-road use of transport fuels will see reduced tax credits. However, agriculture, fisheries, and forestry sectors have been exempted. Use of transport fuels for air travel will see increased excise duties, while in the marine and rail transport sector, the tax credits will be reduced. Non-transport use of gaseous fuels will now no longer be exempted from the excise duty. Offsets under the carbon price scheme: the government will auction or distribute emission permits as depicted through red arrows. The liable entities will then offset their emissions using domestic offsets through forestry projects depicted through green arrows. They can also use international offsets depicted in blue arrows. The international offsets can come from EU ETS, developing countries, least developed countries, New Zealand ETS, the upcoming California Cap and Trade Scheme, and the Western Climate Initiative. Liable entities can fulfill a maximum of 50% of their obligation through international offsets. Demand for international offsets. The Federal Treasury has forecasted that between 2012 and 2020, the carbon price scheme will reduce 152 million tons of carbon emissions. This translates into a maximum demand of international offsets to 76 million tons. However, the Treasury expects that the actual demand will be higher at 94 million tons. On the basis of the economic growth and the growth in the industrial sector, Climate Connect research concluded that Australia can reduce 151.2 million tons of carbon emissions by 2020 through the carbon scheme. This translates into maximum demand of international offsets at 75.6 million tons. However, the actual demand is likely to be significantly higher than this limit. This is due to the high prices of domestic offsets, which is likely to trigger the safety valve mechanism, and the recently introduced opt-in rule. Demand for international offsets will depend on two criteria: the safety valve mechanism and the opt-in rule. The safety valve mechanism will be triggered when the price of domestic offsets is greater than that of international offsets. This will allow the liable entities to purchase international offsets exceeding the 50% limit. The recently introduced opt-in rule will be applicable on businesses using liquid and gaseous fuels. These include businesses using heavy-duty vehicles and airlines. These liable entities can purchase offsets instead of paying increased excise duties. The economic impact on the GDP growth of various states. The maximum impact of the carbon price is likely to be seen in Victoria, Queensland and New South Wales, which have 44% of the liable entities. In addition to the substantial financial assistance to households, the government will also use the carbon revenues to compensate the industrial sector. The steel manufacturing sector will be provided with an assistance of $9.2 billion in the form of free emission permits, while the coal industry will be given $1.3 billion to secure jobs. Carbon farming initiative. The credits issued under the carbon farming initiative will be given only for additional abatement. The credits will be exchangeable with Kyoto-consistent offsets, and the prices are likely to vary according to the type of project. Standard crediting period will be of 7 years. The Federal Treasury expects a supply of credits worth 58 million tons by 2020. States which are likely to contribute significantly in the CFI scheme are Tasmania, South Australia, New South Wales and Queensland. The state climate policies. The New South Wales had announced the greenhouse gas abatement scheme, which is among the first cap and trade mechanisms around the world. It has a target to reduce 60% of its GHG emissions by 2050 and intends to increase the use of renewable energy by 20% by 2050. It also plans to save 4,000 gigawatt-hour of energy by 2014. In Western Australia, the government has announced a low emissions energy development fund. In Queensland, the government has announced a sustainable energy innovation fund and smart energy saving program for businesses. In Northern Territory, the government has announced environment grants program and energy smart buildings policy. In South Australia, the government has announced solar feed-in tariff scheme and plans to improve its energy efficiency in buildings by 25% by 2040. In Victoria, industries have formed the Melbourne Carbon Export Cluster. Australia's stand on climate change. Australia is opposed to extension of the Kyoto Protocol beyond 2012. It has pledged $599 million in Fast Start climate finance, which include $309 million for adaptation, $144 million for low emission growth, and $146 million for grid activities. It has also pledged support for Red Plus activities in the Asia Pacific countries. Thank you. You may mail in your queries at info@climate-connect.co.uk.